So we will begin. My name is Emily Given. I'm the Director of Christian Formation here at St. David's. I'm so glad to be here this morning with the Reverend Dr. Flora Keshgegian. Do I have that right? Yes. So this is the second week of you being here with us, and we give thanks for your ministry among us. And so again, friends online, if you have questions, adult formation questions or formation questions at stdavidschurch.org. But we will begin. Flora, thank you so much. I'm going to turn your microphone on just right now. Just sort of, yeah, if you sort of stay in the middle, but you're not, there you go, go ahead now.
Well, it's fine. Thank you for being here. So today we're going to talk about witnesses to grace, and I'm doing that for a couple of reasons. One is where we are in the church calendar. So Tuesday, November 1st is All Saints' Day, and Wednesday is All Souls' Day, or the souls of the faithful departed. Liturgically, you're celebrating those days next week, but I'm focusing on them here today. And both those commemorations are about remembering and celebrating the saints and the souls that came before us. So then the question becomes why? Why do we do that? And what is the connection of saints to grace and growing in grace? So that's what I want to focus on today. And I'm starting with a bias and a motivation. And we live in a society, especially in America, that emphasizes values and valorizes the individual and individualism. And theologically, when it comes to grace, that's a problem. And why? A lot of the theological discussion about grace and how it works, what we talked about last week or 2 weeks ago, focuses on will, the human will. God's will also, God's will and human will, as well as the locus of choice, behavior, etc. Now, when they started talking about it in relationship to will, the modern idea of individualism did not exist. It just did not exist. That really comes, the strength of that comes after the Enlightenment. So will and individualism were not necessarily connected. But when we talk about will today, it too often gets viewed through the lens of individualism and reinforces it. And we think of ourselves as autonomous beings, separated, individuated. It's about us and for us. And when we talk about will, we're talking about our will, what's going on in us and for us. But I think grace is corporate. It is not individual. It affects the person, but it's not an individual possession, so to speak. It's in the world. God's grace is everywhere. And so we need to cultivate senses of connection, and that we are not just alone and autonomous. And what we're learning today from science and other approaches to knowledge is that we're not separate, individual, unconnected beings, but rather that everything and everyone is interconnected. That at the heart of reality is connection, relatedness, dynamic energy, ever affecting and being affected. So if that interconnectedness, interrelationship is closer to the reality of the universe, how do we live into that? How do we begin to be less I and more a part of we? So I think a resource to help us move away from that emphasis on the individual to this more collective and relational ways of thinking is being is those we learn from whom we learn faith. who tutor us in grace, with whom we are connected in the communion of saints. Communion means being together, being interrelated, being tied together somehow, even if we don't necessarily feel it or experience it that way. The reality is we are interconnected, whether we feel it or not. So let me illustrate with a story that's a vision I had. I don't often have visions, but this was one. It was at Barbara Harris's consecration as bishop. And for those of you who may not know, Barbara Harris was an African-American woman and priest in this diocese who was elected to be the suffragan bishop of Massachusetts. And this was in and her consecration was in 1989, so she was elected in 88. Now, suffragan bishop means you're assisting bishop. In larger dioceses, there are too many parishes for the bishop to get around to all of them as it's canonically required. So there's often a suffragan bishop or an assisting bishop, but it's a full bishop. So Barbara was the first woman bishop in the Episcopal Church and in the Anglican Communion. So many of us, especially women priests like myself, were very excited and happy about this. Others, as you can imagine, were not. And at that time, there were a lot of people that still had issues just with the ordination of women itself. So there were, but regardless, her consecration was going to be a very big deal and needed a larger venue than the cathedral in Boston. So it was in Heinz Auditorium, which is, part of like a convention center. So you can imagine what the large room was like. So many people there. I mean, it was packed. And it was a building that didn't have a ceiling like this, but rafters and girders and all that. So during this consecration, the vision that I had was that there were all these women up there, women from Christian history, and they were all there, but they weren't all in the same mood. Some of them were smiling. Some of them looked quizzical and confused, like, what is this going on? And some of them clearly did not look happy. So it wasn't like they were there necessarily to celebrate this, but the fact that they were there, what that said to me is, we're all interconnected. They're here, whether they want to be, so to speak, or not, because this is something that's happening in and for the communion, both across the globe, but also across time. And we are connected across time with those who came before us and those who were present now. So the communion of saints gathers in all the witnesses to grace who serve not only as beacons for us or role models, but who are connected to us and us to them in the body of Christ. We talk a lot about the body of Christ in church, and it's another image that we can use for this interrelatedness. And the communion of saints is reflective of ongoing life with God, when the dynamic relatedness that we can maybe only intimate now will be fully manifest. So, who are the saints and how do they witness to grace? Saints in the Episcopal Church are viewed differently than saints in the Roman Catholic tradition. Roman Catholics pray to saints. Saints perform miracles. That's how you become a saint. For Episcopalians, however, saints are witnesses and examples. We're all called to sainthood for one another, but the people that get designated saints have manifest that in a way that is something we can learn from and emulate. So I don't know how many folks know these things, but do you know there's a calendar of saints and saints' days? So if you don't, in the prayer book, it starts on page 19. And it's, every month, there's a calendar for every month. And The days that are in bold are the really special days in the church calendar, and the ones not in bold are pretty much the calendar of saints. So this is the, 1970 whatever prayer book. I'm sorry, 19? In mine, it's 19. Excuse me?
So is everyone looking at the birthday to see who their birthday saint is?
Oh, yeah. I don't think I have one, at least not in this calendar. Nope, I don't. But if you just sort of take a look at who's there, you'll notice that there are a lot of dates that are really, really old. They're mostly men. A lot of them are martyrs, and martyr literally means witness to the faith. But martyrs are killed for the faith, or die for the faith in some way. So a lot of the early saints, and ongoingly too, were martyrs. In the last several decades, this list has been expanding. The most recent one in the list that's in the prayer book died in 1942. So we're talking 80 years ago. And even when this prayer book was done, that was like 40-something years. Now, usually it takes 50 years. The church would like you to be dead for 50 years before you're declared a saint. But even that is getting changed more recently. So now the question becomes, who is included in the calendar and why? And I said a lot of them are martyrs. They're also leaders of the church, theologians, those who made a difference, those who evidenced the grace of God in their lives and in their deaths. And again, I said already, most of the ones that were in the list were men. So the Episcopal Church is always expanding this list, and it has been doing so especially in the last several decades. And that is to include more recent and diverse witnesses. So now we have a provisional list. So this hasn't been finally approved by the church, but it's 7 pages, and I didn't have copies, but if you look at it, it's a lot denser. There are a lot more. So, in fact, now there's one on my birthday. So, yeah.
Is this the Anglican Church Communion or the Episcopal Church?
Well, it's this particular calendar.
I just have to ask it again, sorry. So the expanded list or the whole list, is that in the Anglican Communion or just in the Episcopal Church?
The way our polity works, these decisions are made by jurisdiction. So this is the Episcopal Church, and the decisions are made by General Convention that meets every 3 years. So if you want to include somebody, anybody can do this, by the way. If you think somebody should be in the calendar, you can make a proposal. Usually you need to have a few other people besides yourself, but you can petition General Convention to add that person in, and then there's a deliberation and a decision is made. So all these names that are listed here, and I have 7 pages of this calendar, and it's all like this, like one on a line. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. So all these names came before General Convention, and some of them are called provisional, which means the full process hasn't happened yet, but they're on their way, kind of thing. Yep. Mike?
I have a question on that as well, sorry. You mentioned a couple minutes ago that the most recent saint died in 1942?
In the prayer book.
In the prayer book, yeah.
Yeah.
I was flipping through it and I saw Martin Luther King
I'm
listed.
sorry, I can't.
I saw Martin Luther King Jr. listed in there, and I didn't know, I just wanted to ask if you know whether that's provisional or not, because that's 1968.
Oh, wow, is he? I didn't realize
April
that.
the 4th. April 4th.
He's not in this prayer book?
He is in this
Oh,
one.
that's interesting.
Yeah, I was just curious about it. Yeah.
Yeah,
If you
well,
know
I'm
much
going to talk
something
about
it.
him in a minute. I didn't realize the list had been updated. I guess my prayer book is really old.
So as church publishing republishes and sends out, they update some of those things. So that's
Okay.
probably why that showed up.
That's good to know. I know there's going to be, the people who are in this calendar are collected in a book that's called Lesser Feasts and Fasts, because every saint for their day gets a collect and readings, and that's what's listed in the Lesser Feasts and Fasts. And I know there's a new one coming out in 2023, and I think the last one was either 2018 or 19. So yeah, it does get updated, but I didn't think they actually put them in. That's great. So I didn't know that. Thank you for pointing that out. But yes, Martin Luther King was added since the prayer book was first revised. And Barbara Harris just got approved provisionally. And her days will be February 11th, which is the day of her consecration. And so she'll be in the calendar down the road. But another person who got included recently is Pauli Murray. Has anybody here heard of Pauli Murray? Anybody else have heard of Pauli Murray? You have heard of her? So Pauli Murray, who was she? So I'm going to repeat some of that because you didn't have the mic, but thank you. You're right on. She was the first African-American woman ordained an Episcopal priest, and that was sort of later in her life. And before that and after that, she was also a lawyer. And one of the first African-American women lawyers. And she was very involved, as you said, in social justice issues. She worked at ACLU with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So they were colleagues, and she was part of the argument that fed into Brown versus Board of Education. So she was like on the front line with so many things. She was also not gender specific, and so that whole aspect of her life is also something that she brings to this. Yep. It's not on.
So another thing, on Amazon right now, there's
Yes.
actually an amazing documentary about
was gonna
Pauli
say
Murray.
that.
Yep.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Just called Pauli.
No, it's called My Name is Pauli Murray.
Oh, is it? My name is Pauli Murray. Okay, there you go.
I mean, unless they changed it
Oh, I don't
when
know,
I
but-
watched it.
But yeah, it's fantastic. Well, yeah, look for Pauli Murray. It's really an excellent, excellent piece.
It is. I've watched it twice now, and I actually had read a whole biography of her, so it's not like I didn't know much about her, but I still got things out of the film, and it also has footage of her, archival footage of her, so that's great. So that's somebody that's been added, and her day is July 1. Another one, as was mentioned, was Martin Luther King Jr., and his day, April 4th, is again the day he died. Oscar Romero, who was the bishop in El Salvador. He was killed because he spoke out about the needs of the poor and social justice issues, and his date is March 24th. And I put him in there to illustrate you don't have to be Episcopalian to be in the, well, neither was Martin Luther King Jr., so it's not restricted to Episcopalians. So again, that's a difference from the Roman Catholic way of doing this. And another one is C.S. Lewis, who was a writer, and he wrote a lot about faith issues, and his date is November 22nd. He died in 63. So these are the folks, and there's so many more, but I just, picked out a few. These are the folks the church puts before us as saints, examples and witnesses to faith. But saints are everywhere. Teachers of grace are everywhere. And just to illustrate that, I thought we'd look at a song and even try to sing it. And if for the folks at home, if you can grab a hymnal, it's hymn 293. It's called "I Sing a Song of the Saints of God." And I think I'm including it because it speaks to this notion that saints are everywhere and can be anyone. And I can't sing, so I've asked our choir member to lead us. Oh, you got another one, yeah.
So if you're at home and you don't have a hymnal, you can Google up, just put hymnal 1982, and it will pop up. Or
you
even
can
just, I sing a song of the
yeah.
saints of God. Just look directly for it, and you'll be able to find it.
That's how I got the words to cut and paste into this. So I just Googled it. So why don't we stand for this?
293, page 293 in the middle. I sing a song
The saints of God, patient and brave and true. I cannot sing this song without smiling. And part of it is because of the imagery is so, a T. It's so, first of all, English, and it was written by the woman who wrote it. It's written by a woman. His name is Lesbia Scott, and she wrote it in 1929, and she wrote it for her children. She wrote hymns or church songs for her children to teach them about things, and this was one. And in 1940, it was introduced in the United States, and actually that changed. They wrote a tune for it. So the tune you're singing is not the original. It was written in America. But the images of, you've got these people who, were doing sort of extraordinary things, and then you have people that are just living their lives. And, the point is we learn about grace from all of them, or we can learn about grace from all of them. And that's what we're called to, too. So they're examples for us. so that we can grow in grace, but our growing in grace then provides examples and witnesses for other people. Yep.
I have a question. We've talked in this series about grace being undeserved, and I get caught up with it being undeserved and us being sinners, and we can all be saints. They seem sort of opposed in a way. So or is it just that all sinners can be saints?
So, last time when I talked about that, I said that often the undeserved part gets understood as we're not worthy. And I think it's not a word that I would use very much. I would use the word gift, that it comes as gift, but it's there for anybody. It's not like, there's only a little bit of it, so it's not available to you. I think it's available to anybody. And, last time we talked about being open to it, that's a way that you then respond to it. And I think the hymn is sort of getting at that too. Like, you can be anywhere doing anything, even having tea, and you can still be an example of God's grace for yourself and experiencing that yourself, but also being that for other people. Yep. Yeah.
It's on.
I'm going to go back to the Old Testament when we start thinking about the grace that God gives us. And I come up with Abraham and Isaac. God gave Abraham a promise that he would be a father of all nations. And at one point, God said to Abraham that he is to go up into a mountain and make a sacrifice. And in his mind, in Abraham's mind, it was, and he said to the slaves, we will go up and we will come down. We meaning himself and Isaac. And Isaac's question was, well, who's the sacrifice? And to some extent, the grace and the faith that Isaac had was somewhat similar to his father, Abraham. Abraham carried out what God had called him to do, to make a sacrifice, which meant that Isaac had to allow himself to be tied and bound and put on an altar and possibly being killed. But God, having given Abraham that promise, and Abraham following through all the way through to sacrifice the one that was most precious to him, God tested him and he followed through. And I think that in that sense, that's what a lot of the saints wind up doing, or just ordinary people. They're given extraordinary things to do, or something that seems like so out of fetch with what they can do, and God's supernatural grace and loving kindness comes through. And so here comes the ram, and it becomes a clarity that what Abraham believed, that faith that he had, followed through all the way. And God, in his faithfulness, followed through all the way as well. So Isaac was not sacrificed.
That's a good story from the Old Testament. What I would like to, so many of the examples in the Bible involve death. I mean, Isaac was saved in that sense, but it's still this notion of obedience means even unto death. And I think that's, important, because there are always going to be martyrs. There are always going to be martyrs. But I also, perseverance, which you talked about, can also be not being martyred, but sticking to it. And Pauli Murray, to me, would be an example of that. I mean, there were so many times when she was told no. There are resonances between her story and Ruth Bader Ginsburg's in terms of, no law firm would hire her. things like that. But she persevered. She was true to what she felt was her calling, which it was a calling, first to the law and then to priesthood. And whatever the circumstances, she stuck to that. So I think, that perseverance of the saints is definitely, something to consider. Are there any questions? Hold on a sec. The next thing I wanted to do, we don't have a whole lot of time left, but I want you to reflect on who has taught you about grace. Who has been a saint or a blessed soul for you in your life? So just take a couple of minutes in silence to reflect on that. Who is that person? How did they do that? What did they teach or offer you that helped you grow in grace? And what did they reveal to you in grace? And I invite the folks at home to do this too. So who, how, what did they teach you? What did they reveal to you about grace? Can we just... No, I want to wait another minute or so. Give people a chance to really think about this. And now I would invite you to briefly, because we really don't have much time, but just, like in a sentence or two, if you're willing to share who this person is and how they were a saint for you, and folks online could do that too. They could write it in and you could read it for us. Anybody want to share? It's always the hard part. Can we have... Thank you.
I would say it was my aunt. She wasn't my actual biological aunt, but someone who I brought into my life and adopted. And she was one of the last children to get polio.
I still can't, yeah.
You can't hear me?
Yeah.
So she was one of the last to have children to get polio because she was too old to be vaccinated right when it came out. So she was in a wheelchair all her life, but she managed to have children, and she was a speech pathologist, and she just exuded love with everything that she did. She had unadulterated, unbiased acceptance and tolerance, and I just never saw that in such personification, except for her. So she was an example.
Thank you. Anybody else? Anybody from home? No, they're all being shy.
I would have to say it was a surrogate father, Father Paul Washington. What he did was he was a preacher, and he always was concerned with those who were the least of them, and he preached that at a time when there was a lot of social unrest. And what that said to me was, what he said to me was, not if, but when. Yeah, regardless of what you experience, when you preach, say what God told you. And it's hard to fashion that because there's so many things you have to experience and things you have to go through in order for that to come to fruition. But he left me with that belief that God gives us something to do, and he knows that we're going to follow through, and we just have to take our faith and our courage and just follow through.
Paul Washington was rector of the Church of the Advocate in North Philadelphia for many years, for those of you who may not know. And actually, he was the preacher at Barbara Harris's consecration, because that was her original parish. Anybody else? Okay. So we're about to come to the end of our time, and carry these thoughts with you, and especially like as we get to All Saints Day and All Souls Day, and think about, other people too who might have been this for you, because that's how we learn things, right? We see other people, and it makes things possible that we didn't think of as possible before, because they're doing it, or they have this attitude, or they're dealing with all these kinds of obstacles in their lives. So growing in grace is an ongoing process for ourselves and for the whole community of saints and souls, and even all of creation. Saints are our companions along the way, the lived lives of grace, which doesn't mean they were perfect. None of them are perfect. No one is perfect. Nor does it mean that they were always faithful. There were times when they probably doubted all sorts of things. But even not being perfect, even having doubt, grace was still manifest in them and through them to others. Did you? I thought you were going to. So any final questions or thoughts? Thank you. I have really, I've just was here for 2 weeks, but I've really enjoyed this time with you. And I'm really so glad and grateful you're doing this. And I mean that seriously. One of the things that the church talks about a lot is that how we don't keep growing in grace because we don't keep learning or opening ourselves to new things. And I'm really delighted that St. David's has such a vigorous education program for adults too. So thank you.
Well, Flora, thank you so much for being with us. And what people might not realize is that you are an author, so we can continue to learn from Flora if you check out your website, which is florak.org, florak.org. So you can see more about you and continue to learn. So thank you so much for being a part of our...
And the books are on Amazon, too.
There you go, absolutely. Thank you so much.